Rosalind?
You were not supposed to be here. Desmond, please wait.
Who was there?
My husband.
Your Grace, can you see me? Perfectly. Then your wife must be told. She must believe I am still blind. What will you do now? Nothing. Nothing? Until she speaks first.
There is something I need to explain.
Then explain it.
I am afraid you have already decided.
How long will you wait? Until I understand what she is hiding. And then? Then everything changes.
The candle had burned low in Duke Desmond Voss's chamber, but he did not need light. He had not needed light in 3 years. He sat in his favorite chair by the cold hearth, fingers laced together, listening to the surgeon's nervous breathing beside him. Dr. Aldous Penn had traveled 4 months from the eastern colonies, carrying with him a procedure no physician in the capital dared attempt. A blade so fine it could part scar tissue without severing what little remained beneath it. A risk so great that even the Duke's own steward had begged him not to try. If it fails, Your Grace, Penn had warned the night before, you will lose what little light perception you have left. You will be blind in truth, not merely blind in fact. I am already blind in fact, Desmond had answered, his voice flat as stone. There is no truth left to lose. Now the bandages sat heavy and damp against his face, and beneath them his eyes burned with a sensation he had almost forgotten. Light. Not memory of light. Light itself, pressing against closed lids like a living thing trying to claw its way in. Slowly, Your Grace, Penn murmured, his shears working at the linen. Do not rush the unveiling. The eyes will need time to take it off. Desmond's voice cracked through the room like a whip. 3 years of patience had ended the moment he felt that light. Now, the final wrap fell away. For a moment there was only a blur, a wash of gray and gold. Shapes swimming without edges, like a world seen through water. Desmond blinked and blinked again, his breath coming faster than he wanted it to, faster than a duke should ever allow himself to breathe in front of a servant. And then, the world resolved. The first thing he saw, with perfect, merciless clarity, was his own study door, ajar, candlelight spilling from the room beyond, the room where his wife conducted her correspondence late into the night, where she had told him, just an hour before, that she was tired and wished to retire early. He should have stayed in his chair. He should have let Penn finish his examination, let the moment settle, let himself simply see before he did anything else with the gift he'd waited 3 years to receive. Instead, something pulled him to his feet. Some old soldier's instinct, some buried thread of suspicion he hadn't even known he'd been carrying, dragged him across the room, down the corridor, toward that sliver of light. He pushed the door open without a sound, and there she was, Duchess Rosalind Voss, his wife, his anchor, the woman who had read to him every evening for 3 years in a voice so gentle it had become the only color in his colorless world, stood in the arms of a man who was not her husband. Her hands were pressed to the man's chest. Her face was tilted up toward his, and there were tears on her cheeks, the kind of tears that came from something far more complicated than simple guilt. The man was Lord Edric Thorne. Desmond knew the silhouette even before his newly restored eyes adjusted to the candlelight. The same broad shoulders, the same arrogant tilt of the chin that had irritated Desmond at court for a decade. Edric Thorne, his cousin's husband's brother. Edric Thorne, who visited the estate on business no fewer than 3 times a month. Edric Thorne, whom Desmond had never been able to see, and so had never been able to truly judge. Now he could see everything. He saw Rosalind's fingers curl into the fabric of Edric's coat. He saw the way Edric's hand rested at the small of her back, low, familiar, the gesture of a man who had touched her before and would touch her again. He saw, and this was the detail that drove ice straight through his chest, colder than any blindness ever had, the way Rosalind's eyes lifted past Edric's shoulder and met him. She saw him standing in the doorway. She saw him seeing her. The candlelight made his unbandaged eyes glitter, made the truth of his returned sight unmistakable even to a woman who had spent 3 years believing those eyes would never open again. And she said nothing. She did not gasp. She did not pull away from Edric as if scalded, the way an innocent woman might, if caught in an innocent embrace. She did not call out his name in relief that he could finally see her face again after all this time. She simply stood there, frozen, her tears still wet, her hands still fisted in another man's coat, and let the silence stretch. It was Desmond who broke it, not with words, with retreat. He stepped back into the shadow of the corridor before she could speak, before Edric could turn, before anything could be said that would make this moment more real than it already was. He let the dark swallow him the way it had swallowed him for 3 years. Except now the dark was a choice and not a curse, and that distinction mattered more than he could have imagined an hour ago. He walked back to his study. He sat in his chair, and when Penn returned, breathless, asking if his grace was well, if the light had been too much, if something had gone wrong with the procedure, Desmond closed his eyes. "Tell no one I can see," he said quietly. "Not the staff, not my mother, not my wife, no one." Penn hesitated. "Your Grace, that is an unusual request." "It is the only request I am making tonight," Desmond said, and something in his voice, something low and dangerous, the voice of a man who had commanded armies before darkness had ever touched him, made the surgeon bow his head and agree. 3 years earlier, Desmond Voss had been a different man. He remembered it now, sitting blind by choice in his chair, the memories sharper than they had been in months, as if his returning sight had unlocked some door in his mind as well as his eyes. He remembered riding at the head of his cavalry along the eastern border, remembered the smell of gunpowder and horse sweat, remembered laughing, actually laughing, at something his lieutenant had said in the second before the powder keg detonated 40 paces from his position. He remembered waking 3 days later in a field hospital with bandages over his eyes and a surgeon telling him, in the careful tones men use when delivering news they expect to break a person, that the blast had damaged the nerves beyond any hope of repair. He remembered his mother's voice, thin with grief, telling him that a duke who could not see, could not rule, could not marry well, could not be trusted to manage an estate or sire an heir who would not be whispered about in every drawing room in the capital. And he remembered the day his mother had presented him with a solution, a marriage. Not to one of the great heiresses who had once vied for his attention when he'd had a face worth looking at and eyes worth meeting, but to a lesser noblewoman, the daughter of a baron drowning in debt, a woman desperate enough to marry a man she had never seen and would spend a lifetime not being seen by. "She is plain," his mother had said, not unkindly, but with the brutal practicality of a woman arranging a business transaction. "Curvy, not fashionable. Her father has nothing left but the title. She will be grateful. She will not expect love, and she will not embarrass you by seeking it elsewhere." Desmond had agreed because he'd had nothing left to refuse. A blind duke does not get to choose. He had expected an arrangement of cold convenience, a wife who would manage his household and avoid his bed and his company in equal measure, content with the title and the income, and nothing more. He had not expected Rosalind. She had come to him on their wedding night, not with seduction, not with the practiced detachment of a woman performing a duty, but with a quiet, fierce kindness that had undone something in him he hadn't known was still capable of breaking. "I cannot give you back your sight," she had told him, her voice trembling only slightly. Sitting beside him on the edge of the marriage bed they would not, that first night, share in any way but conversation. "But I can tell you what I see if you would like. The room, the candles, my own ridiculous wedding dress, which does not fit properly, because my mother altered it herself, and she has never once sewn a straight seam in her life." He laughed. He remembered that, the surprise of his own laughter, a sound he had not made since the explosion. "Tell me," he had said, and she had. Every night for 3 years, she had told him. The color of the sky at dawn from his study window. The way his mother's mouth pinched when she disapproved of something. The particular shade of red the autumn leaves turned on the old oak by the stables, a red she once described as the color of a secret about to be told. He had fallen in love with her voice before he had ever touched her face. He had fallen in love with her patience before he had ever kissed her. And slowly, carefully, over 3 years of darkness, he had let himself believe that the marriage his mother had arranged out of necessity had become something neither of them had been promised, something real. Now he sat with his sight restored, and the first true thing he had seen with it was his wife in another man's arms, weeping, and saying nothing when she realized her husband could finally see her betrayal with his own eyes. Rosalind did not sleep that night. She lay rigid beside her husband in the dark, a dark she now understood he no longer truly inhabited, though she did not yet dare test that suspicion aloud, and replayed the moment in the study over and over, a wound she could not stop touching. He had seen her. She was certain of it. The way his eyes had found hers across the candlelit room had not been the unseeing drift of a blind man searching for sound. It had been the precise, devastating focus of a man who had looked directly at her and understood exactly what he was looking at, and she had not been able to speak, not because she was guilty, though God knew the scene must have looked exactly like guilt, looked like every nightmare she'd carried since her wedding night about what it would mean if Desmond ever discovered the truth about Edric, but because the shock of his sight returning had stolen every word from her at once. She wanted to wake him now and confess everything. She wanted to explain that Edric Thorne was not her lover, had never been her lover, that the tears on her face had been tears of fear and desperation, because Edric had come to deliver news about her father's debts that could destroy not just her own family, but through the marriage contracts that bound their estates, Desmond's as well. She wanted to explain that the hand on her back had been comfort offered by a man who had once been like a brother to her, nothing more, and that she had let him hold her only because she had been too frightened and too ashamed to hold herself upright alone. But how could she explain any of that to a man who had not spoken one word to her since the moment their eyes met? A man who had simply turned and walked away into the dark, as if the dark were still his to walk into, as if nothing had changed. She turned her head on the pillow and studied his profile in the moonlight. His eyes were closed. His breathing was even. If she did not know better, she would have believed him simply asleep, simply blind, simply the husband she had grown to love across 3 years of careful, patient devotion. But she did know better now. She had seen those eyes open. She had seen them find her. And he had said nothing either. So she said nothing too, and let the silence between them grow into something with teeth. The household noticed nothing different about the Duke in the days that followed, and that was precisely as Desmond intended. He moved through his estate exactly as a blind man would move through it. One careful hand trailing along familiar walls, a measured pace through doorways he had memorized by feel, a deliberate slowness that betrayed nothing of the fact that his eyes now tracked every detail of the rooms he passed through. He had spent 3 years learning to perform blindness as a survival skill, learning which gestures conveyed helplessness and which conveyed competence, and now he turned that same performance toward an entirely different purpose: deception. He wanted to see what his wife would do, now that she believed her secret was undiscovered, or at least unconfirmed. He wanted to see whether she would confess, whether guilt would eat at her until she broke and told him the truth unprompted, the way the Rosalind he had fallen in love with would have done. 3 days. That was how long it took before the first crack appeared. Desmond. Her voice found him in the garden, where he sat on the stone bench beneath the old oak, the oak whose leaves she had once described to him as the color of a secret about to be told. He had chosen this spot deliberately, knowing the irony would not be lost on him, even if it remained invisible to her. "May I sit with you?" Of course. He kept his eyes forward, fixed on a point in the middle distance, the careful unfocused stare of a blind man listening rather than looking. Beside him, he could see her clearly now. The curve of her face, fuller than fashionable beauty demanded, and more beautiful to him for it. The dark circles beneath her eyes that spoke of sleepless nights, the way her hands twisted together in her lap, with a nervousness she rarely allowed herself to show him. She was quiet for a long moment before she spoke again. "Do you remember the night Edric Thorne came to deliver papers, 3 nights past? I was studying. His heart, he had forgotten, in 3 years of darkness, how loudly a heart could pound when sight returned to confirm what the ears had only suspected, beat hard against his ribs. Here it was, the confession, the crack widening into truth. I remember you telling me you were tired," he said carefully, "that you wished to retire early. I did wish to retire early. But Edric came instead, with news about my father's debts, and I'm afraid I was overcome. He offered comfort. Nothing more than comfort, Desmond, I swear it to you, but I—" She stopped. He waited, every part of him aching to know what she would say next, whether she would tell him she had seen his eyes open, whether she would finally speak the thing that mattered most. "I should have come to you immediately and explained," she finished instead, her voice smaller than he had ever heard it. "I should not have let you hear of it from anyone else, or wonder why Edric's visits have been so frequent of late. I am sorry for that. It was an explanation. It was, perhaps, even an honest one, as far as it went. But it was not a confession that she had seen him see her. It was not the truth he was waiting for. Disappointment settled into his chest like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples through every certainty he had built about her over 3 years. "Is that all?" he asked, and he heard the edge in his own voice before he could soften it. Rosalind's hands stilled in her lap. "What do you mean, is that all? Desmond, I am trying to be honest with you about something that has weighed on me for days. And yet you say nothing of what happened after Edric left." The silence that followed told him everything he needed to know, and nothing at all. He felt her stiffen beside him, felt the careful, controlled way she drew breath before she spoke again. "Nothing happened after Edric left," she said. "I went to bed, as I told you I would." She was lying. Not about Edric, perhaps. He could not yet be certain what truth lay buried beneath that particular tangle. But she was lying about the moment that mattered most to him. The moment their eyes had met across a candlelit room, and she had chosen silence over his name. "I see," Desmond said, and the words tasted like a blade in his mouth, sharp with double meaning she could not detect. He let her take his hand as they walked back toward the house. He let her guide him, as she always did, around the low hedge that had once tripped him in his first month of blindness. The hedge she had insisted the gardener trim lower so he would never stumble on it again. He let her believe for one more day that her husband still lived in darkness. But that night, alone in his study with the door locked and the candles burning low, Desmond Voss began, for the first time in 3 years, to plan. He started with small tests, the way a man diffusing a trap might first press gently on the wire to see how much give it had before applying real pressure. He left a letter on his desk, an ordinary household letter, nothing of consequence, addressed in his own hand to his steward regarding the autumn harvest, and watched, through the crack of his study door, to see whether Rosalind would read it when she believed him elsewhere. A blind man's correspondence was always vulnerable to a literate household. It had been a small humiliation he had accepted years ago, the necessity of trusting others to read his private affairs aloud or relay them faithfully. He had never minded Rosalind reading his letters before. Now, everything felt different. She did not touch the letter. She walked past his desk twice that afternoon, and both times her eyes skated over the parchment without pausing. Without the faintest flicker of the curiosity a guilty woman searching for evidence against herself might show. It told him nothing definitive, but it told him something. Whatever she was hiding, she was not actively searching for ways to manage or manipulate his blindness for her own protection. That, at least, was a small mercy. He tested her again 2 days later, this time more deliberately. He arranged, through a quiet word to his valet, for Lord Edric Thorne to be invited to the estate under the pretext of discussing a shared boundary dispute between their properties. A pretext thin enough that any man with sense would question it, but plausible enough that refusing the invitation would seem strange. He wanted to see Edric and Rosalind together again, this time with his own restored eyes watching every gesture, every glance, with the forensic precision of a man who had spent 3 years learning to read meaning into sound alone, and now possessed sight as a weapon rather than a comfort. Edric arrived at midday, and Desmond received him in the main hall with the careful, gracious blindness he had performed for 3 years. Turning his head toward the sound of footsteps a half-second after Edric had actually entered the room, extending his hand a moment before Edric reached him, the small theatrical delays that convinced everyone around him that his world remained dark. "Your Grace." Edric's voice carried its usual confidence, but Desmond noted, now that he could see the man's face as well as hear his words, a tightness around the eyes, a wariness that had not been there in years past. "I confess I was surprised by your invitation. I had thought the boundary matter settled months ago." "Matters have a way of becoming unsettled," Desmond said, and watched Edric's jaw tighten at the words, watched the man's gaze flick, just once, just for a fraction of a second, toward the corridor that led to the study where, days ago, he had held Desmond's wife against his chest while she wept. So, Edric remembered the moment too, and remembered it with enough guilt or fear to betray himself in a glance, even to a man he believed could not see him do it. Rosalind joined them within the hour, summoned by the household custom that required the lady of the house to oversee any guest's comfort. Desmond watched her enter the room, watched the careful, practiced composure she wore like armor, watched the single heartbeat of hesitation in her step when her eyes found Edric standing near the window, watched the way she did not look directly at her husband at all, as though avoiding his unseeing eyes had become as natural to her as avoiding a hot stove. Lord Thorne. Her voice was perfectly civil, perfectly distant. I trust the road from the capital was not too taxing. Not at all, Duchess. Edric's reply came a beat too quickly, a beat too eager, and Desmond, watching now with eyes that missed nothing, saw something pass between them that was not romance, not the easy intimacy of lovers reunited, but something closer to shared dread. Two people bound together not by desire but by a secret too dangerous to speak aloud even in private. It was not the discovery he had expected, and it unsettled him more than confirmation of an affair would have done. An affair, however painful, was at least a simple betrayal with a simple shape. This, whatever passed silently between his wife and Edric Thorne in that drawing room, waited with fear rather than longing, suggested something far more complicated and far more dangerous. He said nothing during the visit. He played his part, the gracious blind duke discussing boundary lines he could no longer see drawn on any map, nodding at descriptions Rosalind provided of property markers and old stone walls, and all the while he watched his wife's hands, the way they trembled, very slightly, whenever Edric's voice grew tense, the way she steered every conversation away from any mention of her father, of debts, or anything that might require explanation in front of her husband. By the time Edric departed, riding back toward the capital with the same uneasy haste he had arrived with, Desmond understood one thing with absolute certainty. Whatever was happening beneath the surface of his household, it was not simple infidelity. It was something his wife was protecting him from, or protecting herself from, or, worse, something she had been forced into by circumstances beyond either of their control. And she had chosen, even now, even after seeing his eyes open in candlelight, to carry that burden alone rather than trust him with it. That, more than any imagined betrayal of the body, was the wound that would not stop bleeding. The ball at Lady Marchmont's estate had been planned for months, a celebration of the autumn harvest that drew half the nobility of the capital into one glittering, dangerous room, the kind of gathering Desmond had once commanded with effortless charisma before darkness had made him a curiosity to be whispered about behind fans rather than a man to be courted for alliance. He had not wanted to attend, but Rosalind had insisted, gently, the way she insisted on all things that mattered to her. It would be good for you, Desmond. People should see that you are still the Duke, still capable, still yourself, even now. And he had agreed, partly because refusing would have raised questions he was not yet ready to answer, and partly because some small, vicious part of him wanted to watch her in a crowded room, wanting to see whether the secret she carried would slip free under the pressure of public scrutiny. The ballroom blazed with candlelight when they arrived, 1,000 small flames reflected in mirrors and crystal, a brightness that would have once delighted him and now simply confirmed, with painful clarity, how much of the world he had missed seeing for 3 years. Musicians played in the corner. Silk and jewels moved through the crowd like a tide, and at the center of it all, Rosalind walked beside him in deep burgundy velvet, her hand resting lightly on his arm in the manner expected of a duchess guiding her blind husband through unfamiliar terrain. Though tonight, the terrain was anything but unfamiliar to the eyes hidden beneath his calm, unseeing expression. She was beautiful. He had known this from her voice alone, from the warmth of her hands, from 3 years of imagining a face to match the kindness she had shown him. But knowing it and seeing it, finally, in the golden wash of ballroom light, with her dark hair pinned high and her curves filling the burgundy silk in a way that drew more than one appreciative glance from men who had once dismissed her as plain, struck him with a force he had not prepared for. He wanted, suddenly and fiercely, to be a man who could simply tell her she was beautiful and watch her smile in response. He wanted to be a man without secrets standing beside a woman without secrets, in a room full of light, the way they might have been if neither of them had anything left to hide. Instead, he watched her scan the crowd with poorly concealed anxiety, her eyes searching faces with the wary alertness of a woman expecting trouble to arrive at any moment. Trouble arrived in the form of Lady Genevieve Ashworth, a widow of considerable fortune and considerably less discretion, who descended upon Desmond with the kind of bold, flirtatious confidence reserved for men whose wives could be safely dismissed as unthreatening. "Your Grace." Genevieve's hand found his arm with a familiarity that bordered on impropriety, her fingers lingering a moment too long against his sleeve. "How wonderful to see you out in society again. The capital has missed your presence dreadfully. Such a tragedy. What happened to you? Though I confess I find a wounded soldier far more compelling than a whole one. There is something very romantic about survival, don't you think? Desmond felt, rather than saw, Rosalind's hand tighten on his other arm. A small, involuntary pressure that told him more about her feelings than any words could have managed. Jealousy. Genuine, unguarded jealousy. The kind that could not be performed for an audience. The kind that revealed something true beneath all the careful silences of the past week. Lady Ashworth is too generous, Desmond said smoothly, turning his head toward the widow's voice with the practiced blind man's delay. I find very little romance in stumbling over furniture, I assure you. Genevieve laughed, a bright, performative sound. Modesty becomes you, Your Grace. Perhaps you might allow me the honor of a dance? I am told you were once the finest dancer in the capital, and I would love to discover whether the talent remains, even without sight to guide you. It was, Desmond realized with sudden clarity, a cruel sort of test disguised as flattery, an invitation designed either to humiliate him publicly, should he fumble through a dance he could not properly see to navigate, or to draw him away from his wife's side long enough for gossip to take root. I'm afraid my husband tires easily in crowded rooms, Rosalind said before he could answer, her voice cutting through the moment with unmistakable steel beneath its civility. Perhaps another evening, Lady Ashworth, when he is better rested. Genevieve's smile sharpened, but she withdrew her hand from Desmond's arm with exaggerated grace. Of course, Duchess. How thoughtful you are, watching over him so closely. One wonders how he ever managed before you arrived to guard him so thoroughly. The implication hung in the air, unmistakable even to ears that had not spent 3 years learning to parse every shade of meaning in a voice. Watching over him so closely did not sound like a compliment. It sounded like an accusation, the kind whispered in drawing rooms about wives who controlled their husbands not from love, but from the need to hide something. Rosalind's grip on his arm did not loosen, but he felt the slight tremor that ran through her hand, the breath she drew before she spoke again. If you'll excuse us, she said, and steered him away from Genevieve Ashworth with more urgency than the moment strictly required. They had taken perhaps a dozen steps toward the terrace doors when Desmond felt her hand begin to shake in earnest. Rosalind, he kept his voice low, the voice of a concerned husband rather than a suspicious one, though both were true in equal measure. What troubles you? Nothing, she said too quickly. The room is simply very warm. He let her lead him onto the terrace, into the cooler night air, away from the crush of candlelight and gossip. The moon hung low and full above the gardens, illuminating everything with a silver clarity that made his return sight feel almost cruel in its precision. Every line of worry on her face visible now, every shadow beneath her eyes, every small, betraying movement of her hands as she tried and failed to compose herself. Lady Ashworth is a vicious woman, Rosalind said finally, staring out at the dark garden rather than at him. I should not have let her words bother me, and yet they do. Yes. A long pause. They do, because there is truth buried beneath the cruelty, Desmond, and that is what frightens me most. People are beginning to whisper that I watch you too closely, that I control your movements, your engagements, your knowledge of the world beyond these walls, more than a wife should. They do not understand why, and I cannot tell them why, and so they imagine the worst. Tell me why, he said quietly. Tell me what you cannot tell them. For one breathless moment, standing in moonlight with her hand still trembling in his, he believed she might finally do it. He saw her lips part, saw the words forming, saw 3 years of careful silence straining against whatever dam had held it back. And then, from the ballroom behind them, a voice called her name, Lady Marchmont, summoning her hostess duties, some minor crisis with the musicians requiring the Duchess's immediate attention, and the moment shattered like a fine crystal dropped on stone. I must go, Rosalind said, and the regret in her voice was, at least, entirely genuine. I am sorry, Desmond. I will explain everything. I promise you that. Just not tonight. Not yet. She left him standing alone on the terrace, and for the first time since his sight had returned, Desmond allowed himself to truly study the moon without performing blindness for anyone watching. It was, he thought distantly, more beautiful than he remembered, and far less comforting than the darkness had been, because darkness had at least asked nothing of him beyond endurance. Sight asked him to act, and he was no longer certain he could wait for his wife's promised explanation before the waiting itself destroyed whatever remained of the fragile, hopeful thing they had built together across 3 blind years. He found the letter 3 nights later, tucked beneath the false bottom of Rosalind's writing desk, a hiding place he discovered only because he had spent 3 years memorizing every inch of his own home by touch, and his fingers, even now guided by restored sight, still moved with the careful thoroughness of a blind man's search. He had not gone looking for secrets that night. He had gone looking for ink, having run dry at his own desk, and his hand had found the drawer's loose panel entirely by accident. The letter was in Edric Thorne's hand. Desmond recognized the slanted, hurried script from the boundary documents Edric had brought to the estate days before. Rosalind began, with no formal address, the intimacy of the salutation alone enough to make Desmond's chest tighten with something between fury and dread. "I have done as you asked. The debts are settled, though the cost was higher than either of us anticipated, and I fear what your husband will think when the full accounting comes due. You must tell him soon. I cannot keep carrying the weight of his ignorance on your behalf much longer, and I fear what discovery without warning might do to a man already so wounded by darkness. He deserves better than secrets, Rosalind, even if you believe the secrets protect him. Come to me Thursday and we will discuss how best to proceed." Desmond read the letter 3 times, his restored eyes tracing each line with a precision that felt, in that moment, like a curse rather than a gift. It was not a love letter. Whatever else it was, and there was clearly more to uncover, debts and accountings and costs higher than anticipated, it was not the confession of an affair. It was something else entirely, something that involved his name, his ignorance, his protection from a truth Rosalind had apparently decided he could not bear to know. He thought of his mother's debts to his cousin's family, debts he had quietly assumed responsibility for 2 years prior, without ever telling Rosalind the full scope of the family's financial troubles. Believing, foolishly, he understood now, that a blind man's pride was worth more than a wife's full knowledge of their shared circumstances. Had she discovered something about those debts? Something about her own father's debts, intertwined with the Voss estate in ways neither of them had fully accounted for? Had Edric become entangled in unraveling whatever financial knot threatened both their families, and had Rosalind chosen silence rather than burden her supposedly fragile, blind husband with the truth? It was, perhaps, an answer that should have brought him relief. No affair. No betrayal of the heart. Perhaps a betrayal of trust. A wife who had decided unilaterally what truths her husband could and could not bear to hear, exactly as his own mother had once decided what kind of marriage a blind duke deserved. But relief was not what Desmond felt, standing in his wife's study with her secret correspondence trembling in his restored, treacherous hands. What he felt was the cold, sharpening certainty that everyone around him, his mother, his wife, even, apparently, Edric Thorne, had long ago decided that Desmond Voss, deprived of sight, had also been deprived of the right to know the truth of his own life. He folded the letter carefully and returned it to its hiding place exactly as he had found it. And when Rosalind came to find him an hour later, settling beside him with her usual gentle warmth, asking whether he had eaten, whether he needed anything, performing the quiet devotion of 3 faithful years, he let her believe, for one more night, that he still could not see the lie in her eyes, but something inside him had shifted, hardened, sharpened into a single burning question that would not let him sleep. Thursday. She was meant to meet Edric again on Thursday, and this time Desmond intended to be there, watching, with eyes that no longer needed permission to see the truth. Thursday arrived beneath a sky the color of tarnished silver, and Desmond Voss spent the morning pretending to review estate ledgers he did not need to review, counting the hours until his wife would leave for whatever meeting Edric Thorne's letter had promised. She left at midday, telling the housekeeper only that she had errands in the village and would return before supper. Desmond waited until the sound of her carriage wheels had faded from the drive before calling for his own horse, a request that made his stable master blink in open confusion, since the Duke had not ridden alone since the accident that had taken his sight. "Your Grace," the man ventured carefully, "shall I send a groom to accompany you?" "No," Desmond said. "I know this road better than any man alive. I do not need eyes to ride it." It was, of course, a lie built upon a lie, but it was the kind of lie that had kept him safe for 3 years, and he wore it now like armor as he swung up into the saddle and turned his horse toward the village road Rosalind's carriage had taken. He did not follow her directly. He knew where the road led, to the small inn at the crossroads, the only place within an hour's ride, discreet enough for a duchess to meet a man who was not her husband without half the county learning of it by nightfall. He took the longer route through the eastern woods instead, arriving at the inn's rear stable yard a full quarter-hour before she did, and settled himself in the shadow of the hayloft window that overlooked the private dining room below, a vantage point he had discovered, with bitter irony, only because his newly restored eyes had finally allowed him to notice the gap in the loft floorboards that let sound and sight both travel down into the room beneath. Rosalind's carriage arrived precisely on time. Edric Thorne was already waiting inside, seated at a small table with a leather satchel beside him, his face drawn and pale in a way that told Desmond, even before a single word was spoken, that whatever news waited in that satchel was not good news. "You came," Edric said, rising as Rosalind entered, his voice carrying up through the gap in the floorboards with perfect clarity. "Of course I came." Rosalind's voice trembled at the edges, though she fought visibly to steady it. "You said the accounting was finished. Tell me the worst of it, Edric. I would rather know than imagine." Edric hesitated, and in that hesitation Desmond felt his own heart climb into his throat. "Your father did not simply borrow against the estate, Rosalind," Edric said finally. "He borrowed against the Voss name itself, using forged documents that suggested Desmond's blessing on the transactions. If this comes to light, it will not merely ruin your father. It will call into question every contract Desmond has signed in the past 3 years, every decision made on his behalf while he could not read the papers placed before him. Men will say a blind duke's signature means nothing, that anyone with access to his hand could forge his consent, and once that doubt exists, Rosalind, it will never fully go away. His enemies at court will use it to challenge his title, his lands, everything he has left." Desmond's blood went cold in the hayloft's dim, dusty air. "Then we must tell him," Rosalind said, her voice breaking now, all pretense of composure gone. "I have wanted to tell him from the very beginning, Edric. I have hated every single day I have carried this alone, hated lying to a man who has never once been anything but gentle and trusting with me. But I was afraid that if he knew my father had used his blindness, his very vulnerability, to steal from him, it would break something in him that 3 years of darkness never managed to break. I was afraid he would believe I had known from the start. I was afraid he would believe I had married him only to help my father rob him blind, in every sense of the word. And now?" Edric asked quietly. "Now I no longer care what it costs me," Rosalind said. "I have watched him grow quieter this past week, more guarded, and I do not know why, but I fear I am losing him regardless of whether I speak or stay silent. I would rather lose him to the truth than lose him to a lie I chose out of cowardice." Above them, hidden in the hayloft's shadows, Desmond closed his eyes. Sight, in this moment, almost too much to bear, and let the full weight of understanding settle over him like a collapsing roof. His wife had not betrayed him with her body. She had been protecting him, clumsily, secretly, and with a desperation born of love rather than malice, from a truth that her own father had manufactured, a truth that used his blindness as a weapon against everything he had built. And he had spent a week testing her, doubting her, watching her with suspicion sharpened by candlelight, when all along she had been carrying a burden meant to shield him from exactly the kind of pain he had been so certain she was causing. He should have felt relief. Instead, what rose in his chest was something far more complicated. Shame, sharp and immediate, followed swiftly by a fury that had nothing to do with Rosalind at all. Her father. Baron Wexley, the man who had given his daughter to a blind duke in the first place, desperate and drowning in debt, had used that very desperation to forge documents in Desmond's name, to steal against his estate, while his daughter lived beneath that same roof, loving her husband, protecting him, breaking herself apart with the weight of silence to keep her father's crime from destroying the man she had grown to love. Below, Edric was speaking again, softer now. "There is one more thing you should know, Rosalind, and I do not know how to soften it. Your father has fled the capital. He left 2 nights ago, taking what remained of his liquid assets, and he has not been seen since. Some believe he has gone abroad. Others believe—" Edric stopped. "Others believe what?" Rosalind's voice had gone very still. "Others believe he did not leave willingly," Edric said. "There were men asking after him at his lodgings the morning after he vanished. Dangerous men, Rosalind. The kind who collect on debts your father owed to people far less patient than Desmond has been. I do not know if your father ran or if he was taken. I only know that he is gone, and that whatever forged documents remain uncovered will now fall entirely upon you and Desmond to account for, with no one left to explain how they came to exist. In the hayloft above, Desmond gripped the rough wooden beam beside him hard enough that a splinter drove into his palm, the small, sharp pain a strange anchor against the storm rising in his chest. His wife was not merely protecting him from a lie. She was standing, alone and terrified, at the center of a conspiracy that could destroy his title, his lands, and possibly, if Baron Wexley's creditors were as dangerous as Edric's words suggested, endanger lives, including her own. And she had chosen every single day for weeks to carry that terror silently rather than burden a man she believed too fragile, too wounded, too blind in every sense to bear the truth beside her. He had never in 3 years of true darkness felt so completely, catastrophically wrong about the woman he had married. Below, Rosalind had begun to weep in earnest now, her composure finally, fully shattered. What am I going to do, Edric? If the documents surface, if Desmond's enemies at court seize on this before I can explain it to him myself, in my own words, with my own voice, you are going to tell him, Edric said firmly. Tonight, if you can manage it, before anyone else has the chance to tell him first, in a manner far crueler than the truth deserves. And if he cannot forgive me for the silence, even understanding why I kept it, Edric's answer, when it came, was gentle in a way that finally, fully extinguished any lingering suspicion Desmond had carried about the nature of their bond. Then he is not the man either of us believed him to be, and you will grieve that loss the way you would grieve any loss, and you will survive it, because you have survived worse. But Rosalind, I do not believe that is the man you married. I have watched him with you, even in these past strange, guarded days. Whatever has changed in him this week, I do not believe it is a heart capable of turning from you once he understands the truth. Desmond did not wait to hear more. He climbed down from the hayloft with the careful, silent economy of a man who had once led soldiers through darkened terrain, and he was mounted and riding back toward the estate before Rosalind's carriage had even been called to the inn's front drive. He needed to think. He needed, more urgently than he had needed anything in 3 years, to decide how a man revealed the two great secrets of his own heart at once, that his sight had returned, and that his doubt, however briefly held, had been a betrayal of its own kind, aimed at a woman who had done nothing but love him too carefully, too completely, and too silently for her own good. Rosalind returned to the estate as the sun began its slow descent behind the western hills, staining the sky the deep, bruised colors of an ending day. She found the household unusually quiet, the servants moving with the particular hush that settled over a home when its master had retreated somewhere private and asked not to be disturbed. "His Grace has been in the study since early afternoon, my lady," the housekeeper told her, worried about creasing her weathered face. "He asked that no one enter, not even to light the candles. I confess I do not know what to make of it." Rosalind's stomach dropped with a cold, familiar dread. She had planned on the long carriage ride home exactly how she would begin, gently, honestly, with an apology first and the full truth to follow, laid out in careful order so that Desmond would understand not just what she had hidden, but why, and how deeply the hiding had cost her. She had not planned for him to already be locked away, alone, in a darkened room. She knocked softly at the study door. "Desmond, it's me. May I come in?" For a long moment, there was no answer at all, and her heart climbed into her throat, with a fear sharper than anything Edric's news had inspired that afternoon. Then, finally, his voice came, low and rough in a way she had never heard before. "Come in, Rosalind." She pushed the door open and found him seated in the near-total darkness of the unlit study. Only the last dying light of evening filtering through the tall windows to outline his silhouette against the chair he so often occupied. He did not turn his head toward the sound of the door, the way he usually did. That small, courteous delay she had come to know so well. He simply sat, facing the window, as though he could see something in the fading light that she could not. "Desmond," she said again, moving carefully into the room, "there is something I must tell you. I have wanted to tell you for weeks now, and I am ashamed that it has taken me this long to find the courage, but I cannot carry this silence any longer, whatever it costs me." "Tell me," he said quietly, and so she did. She told him everything, her father's mounting debts, the forged documents bearing his name. the terrible use her own father had made of Desmond's blindness to steal against the very estate that had taken her in as a bride 3 years before. She told him about Edric, about the months of quiet, frightened meetings, arranged not for romance but for damage control, for trying to unravel her father's crimes before they could destroy the husband she loved. She told him about the tears in the study that first candlelit night, tears not of guilt for infidelity, but of terror at what Edric had just revealed to her, the first inkling of how deep her father's forgeries truly ran. "I should have told you the very night it began," she said, her voice cracking under the weight of 3 years of careful devotion now laid bare and trembling in the dark. "I told myself I was protecting you, sparing you a truth I believed you too vulnerable to bear alongside your blindness. But I understand now that I was truly protecting myself, from your anger, from your disappointment, from the terrible possibility that you would look at me and see only my father's daughter, a woman who married you under circumstances built on deception, even if I never intended to deceive you myself." She fell silent, waiting, the darkness pressing in around them, both like a living thing. "There is something you should know as well," Desmond said finally, and something in his voice made her breath catch. "Something I have not told you, and the longer I have carried it, the more I understand exactly the fear you have just described to me, the fear of a truth too large to speak aloud." He rose from his chair and crossed the room toward the desk, where a single unlit candle waited in its holder. Rosalind heard the scrape of a match, watched the small flame bloom to life in his steady hands, and felt her breath stop entirely as he turned to face her fully in the new, fragile light. His eyes found hers directly, not the careful half-second delay of a blind man locating a voice. Directly, immediately, the way a man's eyes find another's across a crowded room when something unspoken passes between them. "Desmond," she whispered, "your eyes—" "I can see you," he said. "I have been able to see you for 11 days, Rosalind, since the night Pen removed my bandages, since the night you stood in this very room with Edric Thorne's arms around you, and I stood in that doorway, and you looked at me, and you knew. You knew I could see, and you said nothing." The color drained entirely from Rosalind's face. "You have known for 11 days? You let me believe—" "I let you believe I was still blind, because I did not know what else to do with what I had seen," Desmond said. And now his voice trembled with something raw and unguarded, something she had never heard from him even in 3 years of shared darkness. "I saw my wife weeping in another man's arms, and I did not know whether I was witnessing a betrayal or a tragedy, and I was too great a coward to demand the truth outright. So instead I watched you, Rosalind. I tested you. I doubted you when I should have simply asked you, and for that, I owe you an apology far greater than any silence you have offered me. You doubted me," she repeated softly, and he could not tell, in the small, unsteady candlelight, whether her voice carried hurt or relief or some tangled combination of both. "I did," he admitted. "And I was wrong too. I followed you today, Rosalind. I hid in the hayloft above the inn where you met Edric, and I heard every word that passed between you. I heard about your father's crimes. I heard your fear. I heard you say you would rather lose me to the truth than keep me through a lie, and I understood, finally and completely, that you have spent these past weeks protecting me at a cost to yourself that I never asked you to pay and never deserved." Rosalind crossed the small distance between them, her hand rising to touch his face, which she had touched 1,000 times in darkness, and was now, for the first time, being truly seen in return. "You can see me," she said again, wondering, finally breaking through the fear in her voice. "I can see you," he confirmed, and his hand rose to cover hers against his cheek. "And Rosalind, you are far more beautiful than 3 years of your voice alone ever allowed me to imagine, and far braver than I understood until I watched you weep in that inn today, over a burden you never should have had to carry alone." "Your mother said I was plain," Rosalind said, half a laugh and half a sob breaking through her words. "She said you would be grateful for anyone who would take a blind duke's ring, and that I should never expect more than gratitude in return." "My mother," Desmond said, "was wrong about a great many things, and I intend to tell her so myself, at length, the very next time she dares suggest I settle for anything in marrying you." For a long moment, they simply stood there in the candlelight, his hand over hers, her eyes searching his face with the same wondering intensity he had spent 11 days turning on every corner of the world he had finally been given back. "We have a great deal still to face," Rosalind said finally. the weight of her father's crimes settling back over her shoulders even in the midst of this fragile, aching reunion. The forged documents, my father's disappearance, the danger Edric warned me of. This is not finished, Desmond. It may only be the beginning. Then we will face it together, Desmond said, with no more secrets between us, whatever the cost. I have spent 3 years learning that darkness shared honestly is far more bearable than light hoarded in silence. I do not intend to make that mistake again, in either direction. Rosalind rose onto her toes and pressed her lips to his, and if there were still tears on her face, they were, at last, tears he could see clearly, and understand completely, and share the full weight of rather than merely imagine from the sound of her breath catching in the dark. But even as their kiss deepened, even as 3 years of careful, patient love finally found its footing in full and honest light, a shadow moved in the darkened garden beyond the study window, a figure who had watched the candle bloom to life through the glass, who had seen the Duke's unmistakable, restored gaze meet his wife's in open recognition, and who now turned and slipped away into the night with the particular, purposeful haste of a man carrying dangerous knowledge to someone who had paid handsomely to learn it. The figure moving through the darkened garden belonged to a man named Corwin Hale, a solicitor's clerk who had, until 3 months prior, kept modest accounts for Baron Wexley's dwindling estate. He had been well paid, twice now, for information delivered discreetly to a man who called himself only Mr. Ashford, and who had made it clear from their first meeting that the Duke of Voss's continued blindness was worth a great deal to certain interested parties at court, men who had long coveted the Voss lands and titles, and who had grown patient, waiting for a blind duke's grip on his own affairs to weaken enough to be pried loose. A duke who could see again was worth nothing to them. A duke who could see again, and who had just been observed through a study window gazing directly into his wife's eyes with unmistakable recognition, was worth everything, because it meant the forged documents implicating him in fraud had been created under one set of circumstances, and would now be discovered under an entirely different one, by a man capable of comparing every signature, every ledger, every contract against his own restored memory of what he had and had not agreed to. Corwin rode through the night to deliver his report, and by dawn, the machinery of Desmond's ruin had already begun turning in rooms he could not yet see into. The summons arrived 4 days later, carried by a royal messenger in the black and gold livery of the Crown's Chancery. A formal notice requiring Duke Desmond Voss to appear before the Court of Noble Inquiry to answer allegations of financial fraud connected to certain irregular transactions bearing his signature and seal. Rosalind read the notice over his shoulder, her hand tightening on his arm until her knuckles whitened. "They move quickly," she said, her voice tight with fear she no longer bothered to hide from him. "Someone told them, Desmond. Someone told them exactly what to look for and exactly when to strike. Someone told them I can see again," Desmond said grimly, setting the parchment down on his desk with deliberate care, though his jaw was tight enough to betray the fury beneath his calm. "That is the only new fact in this entire affair. My blindness protected the men who wished to exploit it, because a blind duke's confusion could always be explained away, his signature always disputed as a matter of trust rather than forgery. But a duke who can see, who can compare every document against his own memory and testify to exactly what he did and did not sign, that duke is dangerous to whoever built this scheme upon my darkness." "Then someone has been watching us," Rosalind said, horror dawning slowly and cold across her face. "Someone saw you that night, or since, or both," Desmond said. He thought of Corwin Hale's name only later, when Edric Thorne arrived within the hour, breathless from a hard ride, confirming what Desmond had already begun to suspect, that Baron Wexley's own former clerk had vanished from the capital the same week the Baron himself disappeared, and had since been seen in the company of Lord Percival Ashcombe, a man whose ancestral lands bordered the Voss estate on its eastern flank, and whose family had contested the boundary of those very lands in the courts 3 generations running, always losing, always resentful, always waiting. "Ashcombe," Rosalind breathed. "He has wanted the eastern acreage since before either of us was born. If he could see you stripped of your title, your lands seized by the Crown pending investigation, he would be first in line to purchase them," Desmond finished, "at whatever price the Crown named, grateful for the opportunity, and utterly unconnected in the public eye to the scandal that made the sale possible. It is elegant, in its way. My blindness gave your father the opportunity to forge the debts. Ashcombe's patience gave him the opportunity to weaponize the forgery the moment it became useful, and my restored sight, which should have been my salvation, became instead the very thing that told him the time to strike had finally come. "What will you do?" Rosalind asked. Desmond turned to face her fully, and for the first time since the candle had bloomed to life in his darkened study 4 nights before. She saw something in his expression that reminded her, with a shiver both fearful and thrilling, of the cavalry officer he had once been, a man who had led soldiers into gunfire and laughed in the face of it, before darkness had ever taught him patience. "I will do what I should have done from the moment my sight returned," he said. "I will stop hiding what I can see, and I will use it." The Court of Noble Inquiry convened 8 days later in a chamber of cold marble and colder faces, a tribunal of 5 senior peers seated beneath the Crown's own seal, tasked with weighing evidence that could, if it went against him, strip Desmond of his title, his lands, and quite possibly his freedom. Lord Ashcombe sat among the spectators with the studied, satisfied calm of a man who believed the outcome already settled. Though he was careful, Desmond noted with grim satisfaction as he took his place before the tribunal, to arrange his features into an expression of grave, sympathetic concern whenever the Duke's blindness was mentioned by the prosecuting solicitor, as though he mourned rather than celebrated the vulnerability at the center of the case. "Your Grace," the presiding judge began, his voice heavy with the particular weariness of a man who did not relish the task before him. "You stand accused of authorizing fraudulent financial transactions against your own estate, transactions bearing your seal and signature, executed across a period of some 18 months. How do you answer these charges?" "I answer that I did not authorize them," Desmond said clearly, his voice carrying to every corner of the marble chamber without need of theatrical volume. "And I am prepared to prove it, not through the testimony of witnesses alone, but through direct examination of the documents in question, an examination I was, until recently, believed incapable of performing." A murmur rippled through the assembled peers. The prosecuting solicitor, a thin, precise man named Corfield, raised an eyebrow with poorly concealed skepticism. "Your Grace has been blind these 3 years past, by public record and common knowledge. Am I to understand if you now claim otherwise?" "I claim," Desmond said, "that my sight was restored 11 days before this inquiry was first summoned, through a surgical procedure performed by Dr. Aldous Penn, who I am pleased to say is present in this chamber and prepared to testify to the exact date and nature of that restoration." The murmur became a rush of whispered voices, quickly silenced by the judge's gavel. Desmond did not look toward Ashcombe, though he felt the man's gaze settle upon him like a physical weight, sharp with the sudden dawning understanding that his carefully laid scheme had just lost its most essential advantage. "If your Grace can see," Corfield said carefully, "then I invite you to examine the documents before this tribunal now, and account for the signatures they bear." It was precisely the invitation Desmond had hoped for. The clerk brought forward the bundle of contracts, 11 documents in total, each bearing a signature that, to any casual eye, might have passed as Desmond's own hand. But Desmond had spent 3 years learning his own signature by feel, tracing the particular pressure and rhythm of each letter with his fingertips during the rare occasions he had been asked to sign something by touch alone, guided by Rosalind's patient hand over his own. He knew, in ways no forger studying old correspondence could ever fully replicate, the precise, invisible tells of his own hand. The slight hesitation before the downward stroke of the A in Desmond, the particular flourish he had unconsciously developed on the final letter of Voss during his years of relearning to write blind. He examined each document with careful, deliberate attention, and when he had finished, he set them down and addressed the tribunal directly. 4 of these 11 signatures are genuinely mine, he said. I recall signing them, and upon examination, they bear the authentic characteristics of my own hand, as it has developed across 3 years of blindness, including certain irregularities that developed specifically because I was signing by feel rather than sight. Irregularities no forger working from old, cited samples of my signature could possibly replicate, because they did not yet exist when I still possessed my vision. He held up the remaining 7 documents. These 7, however, replicate my signature as it existed before my blindness, clean, confident, without the particular hesitations my hand developed afterward. Whoever forged these documents worked from samples of my handwriting taken before the accident that took my sight, unaware that a blind man's signature changes in small, specific ways that a sighted forger, working from old letters, would have no reason to know or replicate. The chamber had gone entirely silent now, every eye fixed upon the Duke as he laid the forged documents before the tribunal like a hand of cards finally turned face up. "I did not sign these 7 contracts," Desmond said. "I could not have signed them in the manner they were signed, because by the dates recorded upon them, my hand had already changed in ways these forgeries fail to reflect. I submit that this tribunal calls for a hand analyst of the Crown's own choosing to examine my genuine signature, both before and after my accident, against these forged documents, and I am confident the discrepancy will speak for itself far more persuasively than any testimony I could offer." The presiding judge leaned forward, genuine interest breaking through his earlier weariness. "And who, Your Grace, do you believe capable of forging documents with such particular attention to detail, yet such a critical, fatal oversight?" Desmond turned, finally, to look directly at Lord Ashcombe, and watch the color drain slowly from the man's face as their eyes met. "I believe," Desmond said, "that this tribunal should ask Baron Wexley's former clerk, a man named Corwin Hale, currently residing under the patronage of Lord Percival Ashcombe. I believe Mr. Hale possessed access to old correspondence of mine, predating my accident, and I believe he was paid handsomely, if the timing of his sudden change in fortune is any indication, to forge documents that would implicate me in fraud, precisely at the moment my restored sight made the true authorship of my signature provable beyond dispute. I believe Lord Ashcombe has coveted the eastern acreage of my estate for 3 generations of his family's contested claims, and I believe he saw, in my blindness, an opportunity his ancestors never possessed. This is outrageous," Ashcombe said, rising from his seat, his composure finally cracking. "Baseless accusation, offered without a shred of—" "Sit down, Lord Ashcombe," the presiding judge said, his voice suddenly hard as the marble surrounding them. "You will have an opportunity to answer these claims, but you will answer them under this tribunal's questioning, not through an outburst in an open chamber." The unraveling, once begun, proceeded with the swift, merciless efficiency of ice-breaking on a spring river. Corwin Hale, located within 2 days at a country lodging paid for under Ashcombe's own household accounts, confessed within hours of his questioning, trading testimony against his patron for leniency in his own sentencing. Baron Wexley, it emerged, had not fled willingly at all. He had been quietly detained by Ashcombe's men the very night his debts came due, held not to punish him, but to prevent him from confessing the forgery scheme before it could be fully executed against Desmond. He was found, shaken but unharmed, in a remote hunting lodge on Ashcombe's own lands, and his testimony, once freed, confirmed every detail Corwin had already revealed. Lord Ashcombe was stripped of his own modest title and estate by Crown decree within the month, his lands forfeited in partial restitution to the Voss estate for the cost and damage of the fraudulent scheme, and though Desmond took no pleasure in another man's ruin, he found he could not entirely mourn it either, given what that ruin had nearly cost him. Baron Wexley, for his part, was spared imprisonment only through Desmond's own intervention before the tribunal, a mercy Rosalind had not asked for, and had, in fact, wept against Desmond's chest the night before the sentencing, certain her husband would demand the full punishment her father's original debts and desperate choices deserved. "He is still my father," she had said. "Whatever he has done, whatever danger he brought to your door, I cannot ask you to forgive him for my sake. I have no right." "I am not forgiving him for your sake," Desmond had told her, though his hand had moved gently through her hair as he said it, softening whatever severity remained in his words. "I am sparing him because a debtor's prison will not repay what he owes, and because I find I would rather have my wife's peace than his punishment. He will make restitution through honest labor on lands far from this estate, under terms I have set myself, and he will not again have the opportunity to place either of us in danger through his desperation. That is justice enough for me, Rosalind. Let it be justice enough for you as well." Winter had settled fully over the Voss estate by the time the last of the legal proceedings concluded, and on a clear, cold evening some 3 months after the candle had first bloomed to life in Desmond's darkened study, he found his wife exactly where he had first fallen in love with her voice, seated beside the study window, a book open in her lap, though her eyes, he noticed with a small, private smile, were fixed not on the pages but on the frost patterns forming across the glass. "You are not reading," he observed, settling into the chair across from her. I am watching the frost, she said. It grows more beautiful the longer you watch it. Did you know that? Each pattern branches differently from the last, like tiny rivers finding their way toward the sea. Tell me, he said, the old familiar request rising instinctively to his lips even now, months after he no longer needed her voice to see the world, because he had learned, in the quiet time since the tribunal's verdict, that he wanted her descriptions still, not out of necessity, but out of love for the particular way she saw things, the poetry she found in frost and autumn leaves and secrets about to be told. She smiled, that same soft, patient smile he had first learned to recognize by the warmth in her voice, long before he had ever seen it curve her lips and set her book aside. There is a pattern just here, she said, drawing him gently toward the window, that looks almost like a hand reaching toward another hand, though I suppose that is only because I am thinking of your hand, and how strange and wonderful it still feels, some mornings, to wake and know you can see mine reaching back. He caught that hand in his, there in the cold blue light of a winter evening, and pressed his lips to her palm. I spent 3 years, he said quietly, believing darkness had taken everything worth having from me. I understand now that darkness gave me something light alone never could have. The certainty that you loved me not for anything I could offer you in return, not for a duke's title or a duke's fortune, but simply for the man beneath the blindness, the man you chose to see clearly long before my eyes ever could. And I spent those same 3 years, Rosalind said, her eyes bright with unshed tears that were, for once, entirely joyful, learning that love strong enough to survive darkness is love strong enough to survive anything the light might reveal afterward, even secrets, even fear, even the terrible silence I let stand between us for far too long. No more silence, Desmond said. Whatever comes next, however the light finds us, whatever it shows us about each other or ourselves, we face it seeing, together, with nothing hidden between us again. Outside, the frost continued its slow branching spread across the window glass, and inside, in the warm gold light of a study that had once been the site of his greatest doubt, and was now the quiet heart of his restored, hard-won happiness, Desmond Voss kissed his wife the way a man kisses the truth he has finally learned to trust completely, slowly, and without fear of what the seeing might cost him, because he understood now that it had already given him everything that mattered. If this story moved you, if it reminded you that the people we love are often carrying burdens too heavy and too frightening to speak aloud, and that patience and honesty can heal what suspicion alone never could, please consider subscribing to the Royal Duke Diaries so you never miss the next tale of forbidden love, royal intrigue, and hard-won devotion. A like helps stories like this reach more hearts who need a little hope tonight, and I would love to hear in the comments which moment touched you most, Desmond's doubt, Rosalind's courage, or the quiet, healing truth they finally built together. Remember, love that survives darkness is rarely broken by the light. It is only made stronger, more honest, and more deeply, lastingly true. Thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next story.